speak with this group. I hope we set a record today. That trend line of participation is really impressive, and I'd just like to say kudos to the section. The innovation that you guys keep having in terms of service offerings and listening to voice of the customer was a pleasure to be a part of the remote problem-solving exercise in the fall, and appreciate the opportunity today. I'd like to start off with a little test of our remote engagement capabilities, if that works. So we've got likely over 100 people. I want to make this a little bit interactive. And so let me switch. I don't know how many are familiar with Poll Everywhere. So what I have on my screen is an interactive map. What I'd ask that you do, because we're going to do a couple more questions through the presentation to engage your response, if you could either on your phone or your computer go to pollev.com/JoeVacca520, and it should show a map and give you the opportunity to just punch in, click where you are in the country. I think what we're going to see is a pretty cool representation of just how spread out we are today. Excellent, starting to pop up. So as that's filling in, a little bit of what I'd like to do today is introduce, in the spirit of webinars, some remote engagement techniques. The first half of the presentation, I'm going to share the core of what I presented at the ASQ Lean and Six Sigma conference back in February. It has to do with cross-functional complex problem solving. And over the course of years, we developed some best practices at MassMutual as we went through a lean transformation. And so I wanted to share that as we shared it with the ASQ conference back in February. I'm going to cut it off about halfway through the session, and I want to spend the last half hour, actually maybe 20 minutes, because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. I want to share some of the outcomes of the session we had with the Blue Ridge section back in the fall. We used some of the same techniques that I'm going to share today, but we added a remote flavor to it where we actually did a cross-functional problem-solving session remotely. And so as I go through the presentation, you'll see the differences, but I think it lends itself well to this remote webinar setting. So pretty good distribution here, and kind of a cool technique for those that facilitate a lot of presentations remotely. I would highly recommend Poll Everywhere. It's got about 20 different canned views that you can just easily plug into it, and it's actually free as long as you're doing small meetings. You can just go in. I think up to 25 people can weigh in. So I would highly recommend that. Let me switch over to the presentation in the interest of time. So hopefully you found that remote engagement interesting. So our learning objective, to help you improve cross-functional problem-solving effectiveness. And again, some core elements for the first half of the session and some remote techniques and Q&A for the second half of today's session. So now that we're used to Poll Everywhere, I'd actually like to get your thoughts. I'm almost certain that everyone on this call has been part of a problem-solving effort that involved people from outside their teams that maybe didn't move along as fast or maybe didn't get as an effective result as you would have hoped. And so I'd like to ask you, and I'm going to switch back over to Poll Everywhere. So you can see, as I'm doing this, some of the functionality. I'm going to pull this up on the screen. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, what do you think is the primary reason that a cross-functional, complex problem may take longer than expected to solve? So we've got a pretty good sample size here. Part of why I wanted to share this, one was to engage the group and have you start thinking about maybe some of your own challenges, but two, I'm curious with people weighing in from across the country, what are people experiencing here as a possible cause? Seen accountability weighing in much heavier than the others, followed by lack of resources and then lack of problem-solving expertise. Going to give this another 30 seconds for people to weigh in. And a couple of others. Does anyone want to make a comment as to kind of why they picked what they did? Particularly the accountability. That seems like the overwhelming winner here. And so a little bit of it is probably inherent in the cross-functional nature, I'm assuming is what people are thinking. I'll get into it a little bit more in my presentation. But just if anybody was interested, wanted to give you the opportunity to share a thought. Okay. Well, I appreciate the feedback real time. It is interesting. This is a larger sample size than I've gotten before, and previously had thought of these a little bit in a more balanced way, and it seems like it's pretty clear with this large cross-section that accountability is the primary driver or root cause. We're going to get into some of the things that we found for best practices to deal with that in a few minutes. Let me get back to the presentation. So back at MassMutual, I'm only going to spend a minute on this, but MassMutual went on a lean transformation starting in 2011. And so it was a 5-year journey. You could argue they're still on it today. 11 waves of deployment, 5,000 employees, one team and organization at a time went through the deployment and then continued on into sustainment. And so I share this because it was around 2 years in that we picked up on the issue that these complex, these bigger, more sophisticated problems, they weren't moving along as fast as people wanted. And it seemed counterintuitive at the time. Part of the reason you go through a lean transformation is so that you can get a common language around problem solving. And so the expectation or the hypothesis going in is that that was going to enable the organization. So here's what we found. Underneath a customer and any given problem related to the customer, for those problems that hit multiple functions, and if those problems had a root cause that was not known and a solution that was not known, those were the specific characteristics of the problems that were stalling. If it was, if you note where it says JDI or just do it or basic, so where root causes were known, and the solution was either known or not known, but often it was just within a team, within the walls of a team or an organization, those problems were getting solved rapidly, so much better than before the lean transformation. It was on these complex problems crossing functions that just didn't seem to inherently improve. It actually became more obvious that this was a problem the longer the lean transformation went on. And so we leveraged some of the lean tools that were at our disposal. And this, when I say we, it was a continuous improvement community, around 50 folks from the different businesses of MassMutual. And we did some problem solving and found that the root causes were primarily related to lack of ownership, lack of expertise, and lack of resources. So within ownership, the accountability is not clear, seems logical since it crossed functions. Lack of expertise. So this is in more advanced techniques when you're getting into root causes not known. People across the organization didn't necessarily have the repetitions to build the expertise to be able to navigate these problems. I would tell you that even those 50 or so folks in the CI community, the continuous improvement community, they didn't always have the requisite expertise. Many of them were recruited into the transformation as opposed to being a longer-term lean practitioner. So it was new to them too. And then lack of resources, boy, this is everywhere. More and more priorities, more and more things that people are being asked to do. And so how do you have enough time to do these problem-solving sessions in addition to your regular job? Said differently, folks were not viewing problem-solving as a part of their job. They were still viewing it as incremental. And so what did we do about it? So for countermeasures on lack of ownership, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, the two primary countermeasures was for each of these major problems, we needed an executive sponsor to truly sponsor and engage in the initiative, someone with a vested interest. And then we needed, even though across functions, we needed to find the most logical person to actually own and be accountable for the resolution of the problem. Left to its own devices, those things weren't happening. You'll see when we get to an impact effort matrix that those are not necessarily hard things to implement. When you get into lack of expertise, this is where we wanted to leverage the more experienced folks out of the 50 or so continuous improvement leaders to engage in supporting these cross-functional complex problem-solving efforts as an independent facilitator. So what it did was it removed any potential bias. It said differently, if somebody were to facilitate from a particular function and that function was perceived to have a bias, that could slow down the process. By having someone really experienced that could make sure that the participation was even across the different functions, that independent facilitator paid dividends in that regard. And it's also something that you just can't expect someone to do the first or second try. Facilitating these problems takes experience. And then lack of resources and time, or lack of time and resources, what we did was, some of these problems were around for over a year. In fact, some of them could be traced back several years to even before the lean transformation. What we decided to do was time-bound the effort to 4 to 6 weeks, which seems crazy, I know, but I'll explain how we did it in a minute. And then an efficient preparation phase. So part of the magic is in a really structured and productive preparation phase where you're not really engaging the whole group, at least a lot of time of the whole group, until you have basically everyone on the same page focused on a problem and with enough information at hand about the current condition and the target that you're trying to get to, that you can make the best use of their time. So again, that'll become more obvious in a minute. So at first glance, you probably look at this slide and say, well, that, other than maybe the 4 to 6 weeks, that doesn't seem that hard. And in fact, I don't think it is. And we'll see what your feedback is as we go through the process. So the Power A3 approach, you see 3 phases basically. You see a preparation phase, which takes ballpark 2 weeks. It can take longer, but for the purposes of this discussion, let's say it takes 2 weeks. Then there's an event, typically a half day, but it can extend to a full day. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with a Kaizen event, and so you could kind of think of it that way, but with a lot more preparation, structured preparation. And then once the event's done, there's a check and adjust phase where there's some more due diligence around the solutions identified. There's feedback loops from the different organizations involved, and then there's a final checkpoint on the action plan to implement the actions at the end of that 4-week period. The big difference, and I'll point you to the upper left, that preparation phase is absolutely the biggest difference between this approach and how most teams, at least at MassMutual, and I'm finding it Cigna, and in other people I talk to in other organizations, that preparation phase is everything. That's the secret, that's the magic in this process. If you compare it to, and I'm sure many of you can identify with, when a problem occurs and a group of people get together in the room and you spend an hour talking about it and you could leave the room maybe not knowing you've made much more progress than when you got into the room to begin with. So what is the problem you're trying to solve? Does everybody agree? Chances are people are looking at it differently. Do you have any sort of information, any sort of measures, any sort of voice of customer that you can include in the conversation? Again, oftentimes when teams first get together, no. So what this preparation phase does, and for those familiar with Plan, Do, Check, Act, it's the upper left side of the A3 document, of the A3 storyboard in PDCA. So it's making sure you have a very clear, measurable problem statement with a very clear target, and then collection of current condition and maybe even some preliminary root cause information. A lot of that can be done before you get people together to actually do the deeper root cause analysis and then the development of countermeasures. So I will pause there, and then I'm going to go into each of these phases in a little bit more detail. So quick checkpoint, 20 minutes in. Any questions? I could take 1 or 2, and then we'll stay on track, or reactions to what you've seen so far. Okay. Will be a good 10 minutes at the end for Q&A as well. So here's a little bit more about this magic phase we call preparation. So establish a problem owner and sponsor. We've talked a little bit about that. And again, there's not an exact prescription for this. So, and it's one way to test how important your problem is. If you have a senior leader willing to sponsor it, chances are that's your answer. If you can't find someone to sponsor it, chances are it may not be important enough to the organization to gather resources to go and solve this over that 1 or 2 month period of time or longer. Once you have the sponsor, and I would argue you go in that order, doesn't have to be, but getting someone to own it, to have them align to an actual problem owner that's going to go through the process every step of the way with the aligned continuous improvement resource. Second bullet, the business should own it. So this actually came up from our group of 50 continuous improvement leaders. Where we saw this not work is when the business viewed the continuous improvement leader as owning the problem. So the way to think about it is the business should have an accountable owner and sponsor, and that the continuous improvement leader or the lean expert is responsible for helping to facilitate the process, coach the problem owner and the team through that process. So there's a responsibility, but the ultimate accountability resides in the business. Target 8 to 10 participants. So, and then that final bullet, participants have deep knowledge. They have to be the right participants. So I'll ask you to think about the last time you were in a session with 30 or 40 people in it. And I think we've all been there. Work group dynamics do not work effectively with that many people. There's tons of science around this. You really, if at all possible, don't want to get much more than 10 participants on the core problem-solving team, because otherwise it'll fragment into cliques and groups and people don't stay engaged. So if you're going to limit it to 10, and let's say it crosses 5 or 6 functions, you want a really strong representative from each of those 5 or 6 functions. In some cases, you want to go deeper to get a subject matter expert, but it's got to be that right mix of subject matter experts and kind of usually a mid-level person in an organization. So it's got to be someone that isn't so senior you're not going to get their time and they don't understand what's going on in the organization, but they can't be so junior that they have a very narrow view of that organization. They have to be able to represent the function that's going into that cross-functional problem-solving effort. So 8 to 10 people, and it's got to be the right people. Then you go interview all of them. So before this event, before this 4-hour or full-day event, you want to spend, even if it's a half hour, even if it's 15 minutes, talk with them about their thoughts on the problem. See if they agree with it. See if they have any information they can add that the rest of the problem-solving team members can benefit from. It's amazing what you can collect through those interviews. And usually, if you have 10 people, maybe 1, maybe 2 don't agree with the problem you're trying to solve. And you're going to want to root that out before the actual session. Said differently, if you get to the session and someone just completely doesn't agree with the problem, it's going to be hard to make the progress you want to make in that 4-hour time frame. So get underneath that voice of your problem-solving team member in advance of the session. And collect everything you can. So as the problem owner and the continuous improvement resource work together, they're going to consolidate all this stuff. They're going to piece that story together in the upper left-hand side of the A3. And so for those not as familiar with that, it's the problem statement. I'm going to show you an example in a few minutes of an A3 that we did for the Blue Ridge section remote problem-solving session. But it's really those two people. It's the problem owner and the continuous improvement resource that have to spend a lot of time through the preparation phase. So probably 10 hours each, maybe 20, maybe more through the 2 weeks to meet with each of the other problem-solving team members. The other problem-solving team members, you're only asking for a half hour, maybe an hour of their time through the preparation phase. So think back to not enough time available as a root cause. This helps solve that. You really only need to find 2 people to help gather all this stuff in a structured way. Everyone else on the problem-solving team, including the sponsor, they haven't spent a ton of time on this yet. You've limited it, so now when you engage them in the event, you're making the best use of their time. You haven't wasted 4 or 5 sessions. Think to how things may naturally happen without a process like this. They get frustrated if you have 2 or 3 sessions where they're not productive. They shouldn't feel that if you follow this sequence. Distribute the materials prior to the session, at least 2 or 3 days. Give them, you spent the time to collect it, so give them the benefit of being able to read through it and think about it and absorb it and formulate questions in advance of the session. Seems like a small thing, but huge productivity enabler. And then finally, and this one I'm going to waver on a little bit, set up room for visual PDCA experience. When we created this process, we actually wanted everybody in the room. And we had to find a big conference room with walls you can draw on, and I'm going to show you a picture. Looked something like this. And the visual experience was powerful. For those in the room, you could actually see at any given point in time where you were in the PDCA process and trace back. So if you're looking at a root cause, we'll trace that back to current condition on the problem statement. Or if you want to go the other way, and you say, well, how does that root cause align to a countermeasure, and where does that countermeasure fall in the impact effort matrix? You could actually see it right away. It's very, very accessible for any point in time during the event if a question comes up. Where I'm going to waver is that I think we found a pretty cool way to do this remotely, which I'll share again in the last part of the presentation. So here's the event itself, and I talked about this a little bit. So that hour 1, for everything you collected in the 2-week preparation phase, you want to get through that in hour 1. And it should be familiar to people. So in any other case, there's no way in an hour with that cross-functional problem you could get everyone to agree on a problem statement, a goal statement, and have a bunch of information on the current condition. You now have it. And so an hour at the most, walk through it. They should be familiar with it. Let each function represent their piece of it and maybe give a little bit of color commentary. And then end the first hour, you're ready to dive deeper into root cause. So hour 2, you're going to brainstorm root causes. You're going to apply root cause problem-solving tools, particularly the fishbone. So I'll show you an example of this in a few slides. When you brainstorm the root causes, typically with a cross-functional problem, there's going to be a lot of them. And so a fishbone works particularly well. The sequence typically goes, and let's see if the picture shows this. This one doesn't. When you brainstorm and prioritize the highest level root causes, they would typically go on the heads of the fishbones, and you would take the group through maybe 10 or 15 minutes at a time, a 5 why exercise under each of those primary root causes. I'll show you an example, probably 10 more minutes as we get into the remote facilitation example that I mentioned before. Hour 3, you're going to do a simple brainstorming exercise on countermeasures. You're going to want to link them to the root causes, and then you're going to want to prioritize them on an impact effort matrix. And then last hour, select your countermeasures and build action plans. When these sessions extend to a full day, and for the bigger problems, I actually do recommend it, at least extend it a couple hours since you have everybody together. This is where you can spend more time building out those countermeasures in more detail and get the action plans going. Oftentimes, this piece of it gets crowded out when you have a half day, so you may get to those highest level suggested solutions or countermeasures, but it's not quite actionable yet. And so if that happens, you can still assign it to people to research further in that final check and adjust 2-week period. But you're probably better off, since they're there and the information is fresh in everybody's mind, if you can build it out real time, much more like a Kaizen event, that's usually beneficial. Okay, real quick on the check and adjust phase, and then I want to get to this remote technique piece. So you're done with the event. You summarize it, so the problem owner and the continuous improvement resource together summarize it, send it out to the group. They're asked, the entire group in that summary is asked to share this immediately with their respective function. That function's leaders, other constituents, and get as much feedback as possible as quickly as possible. If someone's not going to agree with a suggested countermeasure, you want to know it right away, and then immediately bring it back, if there is an issue, to the problem owner and the sponsor so you can adjust course. Pitfalls to avoid. Preparation time, it takes 2 weeks. It could take more. You're better off taking extra preparation time and getting what you need than trying to go to the session not ready. If your owner or sponsor is not fully engaged, does not bode well. Facilitation and effectiveness, the way we do it in the continuous improvement community is you probably can't do it the first time yourself. We will pair a less experienced continuous improvement facilitator with a very experienced facilitator the first 1 or 2 times, and so they can really live the experience. And then they're more or less certified to go carry it on their own. And actually, we're leveraging that process here at Cigna now. I'll be honest, that this process is taking off like wildfire, and so we've got more and more people in our operational excellence community that's getting essentially certified in driving this type of process. And then finally, this lack of diligence to check and adjust. And this is going to fall on the sponsor and the problem owner, probably less on the continuous improvement resource. You got to check in. So if you've truly identified a measure of success for this problem-solving effort, you want to check back in 6 months and again in a year, and probably more often than that in between to see what kind of progress your countermeasures are making. All right, this is my last slide before I switch to the remote piece. And I'm not going to actually go, actually I am, what the heck. Let's go back to engage everybody. And I want to get into Pull Everywhere. And let me ask you, what percentage of the problems in your organization should this approach or could this approach be applied to? Is it the majority? Is it the minority? Somewhere in the middle? Oh, this is great. Rapid movement. So it looks like 80% plus and 50% are the bulk of the responses. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, in the interest of time, and I'll leave Q&A open at the end again, this actually surprised me, and it's the second time when I've asked this question to a larger group, I got this response. Honestly, my thought going into this is that if you go all the way back to, I'm going to go back to this slide. So what percentage of your problems are complex? So the bottom of this slide, root cause not known. Usually it's 10 or 20% of your problems. As we worked with teams across MassMutual over 5 years, it typically was less than a quarter anyway. And so we originally thought the Power A3 approach would work really well for those problems, but you probably didn't need it for the basic type of problems where you know the root cause but not the solution, or you're just do it. What I heard at the ASQ conference when I asked the question, and what I think I'm seeing today, is that, boy, maybe you don't want to go through all of these elements for the most simple problems, but there's a pretty large percentage of problems that could benefit from this type of approach. So I welcome any quick thoughts if that's what you're thinking, but you've validated what I've been hearing, and it's different than my initial hypothesis, but now that I think about it and now that I get more feedback, it does seem to make sense. Okay, so we left pretty close between A and B. Okay, so moving on to our session, our remote problem-solving session with the Blue Hills chapter in September. And so this session was created based on feedback from the ASQ section that they wanted to learn more and specifically get practice with A3 thinking or PDCA techniques, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And so the challenge that we had, and I had several development sessions with Norval and his team, is how do we get people repetitions, particularly on complex problems, if they're doing it in a remote way. And so we came up with a two-part session. It's really two different sessions. They're each 3.5 hours, separated by a week. Session 1 is what I would call PDCA 101. And so that was introducing folks to the PDCA approach, its history, provided a couple of tools, including the A3 storyboard. And the session 1 was all about, I think, 2.5 of the 3.5 hours was folks actually working through their own problem on an A3 storyboard. So different than the way most problem-solving training sessions go, we wanted 80% of these sessions to be practice. It's not just someone talking. And so they had to pick a problem ahead of time. And after we went through some of the introduction and history, we went phase by phase. So plan phase, really learn phase first, plan, do, check, and act. And they ended up with a homework assignment after that between week 1 and week 2 to see how far they could get with their problem. Week 2, then, we wanted to go to PDCA 201. And we had to find a problem. So this was a team of about 10 people, so it's in the target range. And the challenge that we had in developing the session was, how do we find a problem that 10 remote people can work on that are all from different companies or organizations, and can they identify with the same problem? Are they having the same experience? So what we landed on, and let me find the slide. So here's our A3 storyboard. I'll zoom it up a little bit. Actually, let me really zoom it, and I'll unzoom it later as I go through the different pieces. So this upper left section with the problem statement, business case, and current condition, we pre-populated the A3 with just those 3 sections. So the problem statement we decided was to replicate the problem that we and best practices that we shared at the ASQ Lean and Six Sigma conference. So our problem statement read, effective problem-solving efforts are taking too long. So most people, we theorized, have that problem in their organization. And so we built out a bit of a business case, can't meet our financial and operational goals and objectives, poor performance, customer dissatisfaction. We listed some current condition, which actually the 10 people readily identified with. So most people said, yeah, there's a lot of big efforts that are stalling, not sure who owns it, is it even the right problem? Most of the time, they're not finding clear measures of success with their problem solving. So everybody recognized this pretty quickly. And so we sent that out ahead of time. The rest of this A3 document was blank. And so here's the agenda we gave them. So it follows the 4-part Power A3 approach, modified a little bit. So we sent ahead of time the A3. We spent the first hour getting people to talk about the problem statement, some of their own experience, so that we got them kind of warmed up through that plan phase. And then we went into root cause brainstorming online. So think of the difference between setting up in the room and having a big fishbone on the wall and everybody participating. In this case, what we did was, bear with me a second, we went into poll everywhere. And we did brainstorming and said, hey, what do you think are the primary root causes of problem stalling, cross-functional complex problem stalling? And so they weighed in, poll everywhere naturally prioritized it or affinitized it. And then we took the primary themes and online, so I was just sitting there typing, showing my screen, we put the major themes on the heads of the fishbones, and then one by one we engaged the group in a 5 why exercise. So lack of engagement, someone would say people don't listen well, or people don't make the time. Well, why don't they make the time? Well, there's a lack of clear priorities, so there's a lack of team roles. You can kind of see how it goes. Because we were time constrained, I cut each one off after about 10 minutes. But it was very easy to see from their initial prioritization of big themes and then discussion where the underlying root causes fell. The coloring you see on there is when we asked them to vote on what they thought was the most impactful root causes. They wanted to use different colors for different people so they could see where they voted, and they simply went on the screen in the WebEx and put in their color of where they voted. So different from doing it in the room where it's all on a big whiteboard and people are going up to the whiteboard and maybe putting red stickers on things to create a heat map. But I would tell you, I found it amazingly effective in doing it, again, because everybody identified with the problem and they knew what they were coming into ahead of time and they had the common goal. The remote piece of it did not detract from the productivity. It was very doable in an hour or so to get through root cause. So once we had that, back to poll everywhere after a little bit of a break, and let's brainstorm based on what we just went through on the underlying root causes and how we voted, so that heat map that we created, what are the primary countermeasures that we want to consider? And so again, they came up, they naturally affinitized in poll everywhere, and then we plotted it on an impact effort matrix. So again, this was just me typing on the screen. I think it was just a PowerPoint real time, and as people had kind of these top themes, formalized PS roles, I would ask them to place it on the chart. You can actually do this piece in poll everywhere too if you wanted to. We ended up doing it just in PowerPoint, and you can see that we had a lot of wows, a lot of high impact, low effort type things, which for the most part aligned with what we came up with back at Mass Mutual to create the Power A3, and that we presented at the ASQ conference. The one difference, and I think a nice add, was the priority lists. So to really know what the priority of the organization is ahead of time will help teams figure out what big problems are most important to solve. So I thought that was a nice add that we can build into the Power A3 approach. And so with that, let me actually go back to what the A3 looks like. So I referenced this earlier in the session. This was another tool we handed out before even session one. So the PDCA 101 that we did with the Blue Hills session, they have a blank A3. I still use this all the time. I think a lot of lean practitioners do. And frankly, I use it not only at work, I've used it on some home types of problems that are more complex, some wellness things, as a matter of fact, and it's worked actually pretty good. And so in this case, we then backfilled, once we had the session, the root cause problem solving, so the fishbone in the lower left. We matched up root causes to countermeasures in the upper right. We listed an action plan, so if this were going to be an ongoing group beyond the training session, they would have a list. The measures of success, critically important for someone to go back and check, and then some final comments on the bottom right. So at the end of the kind of two-part session, so net at most 1 day in total, so 2 3.5-hour sessions and a little bit of homework. They walked away with tools for simpler problems and techniques for more complex problems, including kind of virtual ways to use some of these lean techniques in PDCA. So with that, it's actually about 3 or 4 minutes quicker than I thought it would end, but it leaves plenty of time for Q&A. Would welcome any thoughts on kind of any part of this presentation. So the poll everywhere application, the core techniques of the Power A3 that we presented last year at the Lean and Six Sigma conference, or some of the remote techniques that we developed as part of the PDCA remote training session.
Thanks, Joe. It looks like you've got a few questions in the chat box. Are you able to see them?
Let me get to that. Hold on. If I stop sharing my screen, I think I can.
Okay.
Okay, now I can.
Yeah, just for everybody's information, we've been tracking and seeing who's online. It looks like 106 people are online with us today. That is fabulous. Thank you for all of you for coming on.
All right, let me kind of go through these. So first one, 8 to 10 even seems high to me. The most people we've ever had in a Power A3, a formal Power A3 event, was 17. It actually had to do with a potential fraud risk. And so, highly sensitive thing, a very urgent thing. And so we made it work. I wouldn't say it was ideal. I wouldn't, less than 6, you can do it. It depends on how big the problem is. But yeah, if you can keep it to 10 or under, I would highly recommend it. RCPS is root cause problem solving, often associated with Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is a lean problem solving technique. Really, if you think about it, it's, that A3 has the components of it. The A3 storyboard is probably the most recognized tool within RCPS, not only for the sequence, but also for the tools and the idea that you can put everything in one place so you can see the full spectrum of the problem. Where is the statement in the Power A3? 2 weeks check and adjust would not be enough. You're absolutely right. So again, to go faster, the presentation was more from the continuous improvement leader perspective. And actually one of the things we're finding at Cigna in our operational excellence team, and this is, of all the services we provide, this Power A3 approach is by far the highest in demand and growing rapidly. The one challenge that our own team had right off the bat was how do we build in check and adjust mechanisms to make sure when you look out 6 months in a year that you really got the result that you were intending. So we're actually putting it into our capacity plans. And I'm not saying everybody should do that, but once we support an effort, we physically build in checkpoints further on down the calendar to go in and check with the sponsor and the problem owner in the business how it's doing. So yes, the sponsor and the owner need to keep on track of it. And usually continuous improvement teams, they move on to the next thing. It's how they're designed. But if you could check in with them, I would highly recommend it to encourage the accountability to the outcome.
Hey, Joe, before you move on to the next question, just a quick reminder for folks who did join us online today. We've got several folks who came on that did not register, and if you're going to be looking for a cert for your attendance here today, please make sure that we do get your email address so that way we can get your cert to you afterwards. Thanks. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. So next one, it is a common issue in attempting to make the most use of senior management time that the senior manager does not prepare for the meeting and requests that the team take a different direction. Oh, is it common? So if I'm reading that correctly, I would hope that it wouldn't get to that point. So said differently, I wouldn't recommend spending a lot of time even in the preparation phase unless the senior manager or the sponsor agrees to sponsor it and agrees with the priority, and that you end up with an accountable problem owner. If those things are not there, chances are you're going to need that senior leader for some of the countermeasures. I mean, it's typically going to cross functions. You need a little bit of political support there. And so to have someone at a senior level champion it is going to be important. And without it, you may run into difficulty down the line. So I would hope that if you're worried that the sponsor is going to have a different thought about the direction, you want to get that addressed ahead of time. If you think there are other senior leaders that aren't going to agree, it's also a great use of the sponsor to have them go influence that. Okay, next. I think when the problem is not necessarily complex by definition, the cross-functional component drives the need for an effective problem-solving methodology. Hence, the Power A3 appears to be a methodology that facilitates harmonizing the cross-functional aspect of the problem. That's a fantastic point. I think you hit the nail on the head why people are voting that it should be applied to more than just your most complex 10 or 20% of problems. Can you give a few more points on the check and adjust phase? This was brief. Yeah, it's I think we talked a little bit just in the last couple minutes about you know, the need to go back. So when you end the event, so typically the event, there's high energy, people are pretty jazzed, they haven't been through something like that was structured, that made such great use of their time, that they felt like they were heard in terms of the causes and the solutions. So people are typically pretty energized to do something. When you create the action plan, if there's 8 or 10 people, I would say don't give any of the 8 or 10 more than one big thing to go after. If you can make it digestible, so you may have 20 solutions you want to do, keep it to something more digestible. You know, 4, 6, whatever the most impactful ones are, and then don't overwhelm the team. Maybe you put 2 people on one of those actions to build it out further, and then you get the team back together in 2 weeks. And so for each of the people who took away that action, they get to report out their due diligence to the rest of the group, and you get a final yes or no if you want to go forward with that. You also will know if everyone has shared the feedback on the direction of this with their respective functions, you're going to know if someone's got a problem with it. So once you end that 2 weeks, your problem owner within the business has a plan to go execute. And then you get back to, I would recommend the continuous improvement team, if you have one, checking back in a few months and maybe a couple times to make sure that they continue to make progress. How is flying carp solving fish different from typical fishbone diagram? So this is something that I've just done for a long time. I always ask the teams that I help facilitate to name their fish. And so they called this particular one flying carp solving fish. One of my favorites was, there was such a big fishbone, it had like, 10 major sections. It took up an entire wall of a large conference room. They called it affectionately Megalodon, and they superimposed a Megalodon on it. I still have that one hanging in my office. The difference would be, though, there is a difference from your classic fishbone. So your classic fishbone is going to have more set categories on things like people, process, and technology. What I've found is that a lot of what people come up with are typically process heavy, and so that piece of the fish tends to build out a lot and the other ones don't build out as much. So what you're seeing in that flying carp fish are mostly process type things taken down to the next level. So it just gave more room to dig into deeper root causes on process, but there's no magic to it. If people, process, and technology work as your top themes and you want to go deeper from there, perfectly fine. Do you have suggested templates and practice plans? I mean, the templates are for every meeting that you have in preparation, in the event itself, and in the follow-up, I would highly recommend the A3 storyboard. And it goes back decades in the lean practice. It's just a nice way to show the full spectrum of the problem, and it doesn't show everything. So the way most people do it that I've seen is if it's in, let's say, an Excel file, you can either link it or put a new tab in for each of the sections if you want more information. So at the same time, if you're boiling up each section correctly, the A3 storyboard is going to give you a pretty good picture of the whole problem, and you can show it to anybody, and they're going to have a pretty good idea of the problem, the causes, the recommended solutions, how is the measure tracking. Anyone can get up to speed quickly. I'm just going to keep going in the interest of time. Really like the interactive of completing the fishbone in the virtual A3 meeting setting, very positive. How does your group status and give updates from the aggregate of projects internally? So I think what that's asking is, for our operational excellence team, or if there's a continuous improvement community, how do we track this? I would say, I'll give you a couple different answers. It wasn't well done centrally back in my prior lives, One thing we're doing now is we're getting better at scorecarding, and within that scorecarding, we keep the full spectrum of the projects or problem-solving efforts that we support, and track the key indicators of the projects beyond even when we're supporting them. So we have a demand capacity plan when the thing kicks off. There's an intake process to decide which ones to support based on priorities of the organization. As we're supporting it, it directly feeds into our scorecard. And then even when it's done, it may not show up on our monthly scorecard, but we still keep it in our capacity plan for just a few hours here and there to check in. So a couple of emerging practices that we're playing with, but it's something I haven't seen work well in other places. It tends to get kind of spread out pretty quickly unless you have a really strong central group that's looking at it. In the A3 storyboard that you have, can you go over which sections you typically have completed populate to some degree during the preparation phase? Absolutely. It's the upper left. So by the time you get to the session, and actually in the pre-work that you send out for the session, I would suggest you have the problem statement done and agreed to with a measure in it. So a current measure and then your target measure, so gap to target. Your business case, so why is it important? And then the current condition, everything you collected, it may not all fit in the A3 storyboard, but a way to synthesize all that information. That's going to give you a really good head start on probably your root cause analysis, but you're going to want to get people familiar with that ahead of time. And then your goal statement. So specifically, where do you want to take your current measure, where do you want to get it to, and by when? If you can have that in there for your preparation phase, you are very, very likely going to get through your Power A3 agenda, the rest of it just fine when you bring the group together. Let's keep going. I think we're almost through this. Are A3 form and PowerPoint slides available? They are. The A3, I'd have to defer to ASQ and Norville. So it's the ASQ presentation stays in the ASQ archive. So how we access that, I'm not 1,000% sure. The A3 forms are actually, very readily available. So if you did even a quick search on A3 forms, you're going to see them out there on a quick web search. ASQ even has forms available. I'm almost certain. So I would start there. And I think we're right at the hour, and that was the last question. Unless Norville, you have any final comments, or if there's one more question we have from the group, I'd be happy to take it.
Okay, let me look through here real quickly as to what we received here. We got a few that were sent privately to us here in Virginia. Let me look here real quick.
As you're looking, so quick tour of how you use heat maps in the A3 problem-solving process.
Oh, you got it. So, okay, that was the one.
Yep. So that one, when the fishbone is built out, the final step, and usually this is a nice breaking point for the group, we usually give each group member 3 red dots. So when you're in the physical location, we would give each problem-solving team member 3 red dots and tell them to put it on, from their perspective, the highest impact root cause. And leave them flexibility. So if they want to put 3 dots on one thing that's way internal to the fish, they can do that. If they want to spread them out, that's fine. If they want to put them on the head of a fishbone, as that category is the most influential, they can do that as well. It always turns out differently, and usually with some surprises when you take the intelligence of the group and see how they think the most important root causes are. It's an educated guess. Obviously, it's not like a Six Sigma DMAIC project where you're testing the KPIs against the KPOV and kind of proving out which ones are having the bigger impact. It's not as rigorous a process as that, but usually it's pretty good, and you can always get data later on to prove it if you need to. When you do it remotely, I think you could see how we did it. It wasn't quite as pretty, but we had people just put dots where they thought the biggest root causes were, and it created at least a form of a heat map.
Hey, Joe, we have one last question that we would like you, it just came to us here privately. If you could answer this one, it'd be great. Rapid fire events such as the Power A3 frequently result in introverts on the team not sharing their ideas. Have you experienced this, and do you have any solutions?
Yeah, and it's a great point. I do think there are some elements of this that lend themselves to engaging introverts more, recognizing the challenge. So let me explain why. And I'd put myself on the introvert scale. Presentations like this and 100 people on, my heart skips a beat a few times until I can get into it. And I think a lot of people are that way. The preparation phase desensitizes some of that anxiousness usually. So if you're spending time in advance, someone reaches out to you and you have a chance to talk through the problem and you have your voice heard and you can see it in the preparation materials and there's only 8 people in the group, those things tend to engage people, and then there's an excitement. You feel like you're a part of it. And let me contrast that with a lot of events when they're created, there's not the preparation, there could be 20 or 30 people, people don't feel heard, they can't be heard because there's too many people in the mix. Not everyone's trying to accomplish the same thing. It can be a very frustrating experience, particularly for an introvert. And so you leave there and you think you weren't heard and it was uncomfortable. So I do think the Power A3 process will naturally lend itself better. At some point, there's some engagement that's needed. So there's no requirement once you get to the session itself and there's 8 people. If they're either by choice or they just don't see the value, I could see them staying lower key. And I think that would be up to the facilitator to kind of check in with them offline, might be another control, or during breaks and make sure that they're heard. Interestingly enough, the remote participation creates a way to make it much more comfortable for introverts. I mean, you're not always visible. You can still vote and things like that. You can kind of put stuff on the fishbone. So I'd like to think that might be a little bit more comfortable as well. So I'm not sure how well I answered the question, but I do think it, compared to many problem-solving efforts, it lends itself a little bit better to some of the, I guess, environmental factors that introverts are going to be more interested in.
Joe, one last question, a real quick one. We got a couple chats here asking if the PowerPoint from your talk today will be available.
I am going to hesitate only because I don't know the rules around ASQ presentations. So once we did the presentation for the conference, I know it goes into an archive. I don't know exactly the rules or logistics around sharing those. So we can get back to the group afterwards. It just would take a little bit of research.
Okay, fair enough. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. Looks like we're a few minutes after the hour here. A few people have already dropped off, which is understandable. They may have another meeting they need to get to. I think right now we're just going to go ahead and call it for right now. I'd like to thank Joe for his time presenting today, and also thank everyone who's still online for joining us. The next webinar will be this Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, with Daniel Zermiak. It'll be the cost of social responsibility. If you're not joining us on Saturday, then the next one during the week will be next Tuesday. It'll be Willie Van den Brande with Survival of the Fittest, Quality Tools for the Future. Until then, we'd like to wish everybody a good rest of the day and see you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
All right, thanks.